Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The atmospheric recyclers on Crest 9 made a sound in the early morning hours that the settlement's maintenance logs officially classified as operational vibration within acceptable parameters, and that everyone who actually lived there classified as a noise somewhere between a dying animal and a man trying to open a jar he absolutely should have asked for help with. Lyra Veen had been listening to it for 23 years. She no longer heard it consciously. It had become part of her biology, that sound, something her sleeping mind registered and dismissed the way other people dismissed birdsong or rain, except that birdsong and rain were things she knew only from the settlement's shared databank archives and had never once experienced in her actual body. She was awake before her shift alarm, which was a habit she had developed not out of discipline, but out of the specific anxiety of someone who could not afford to be late and did not trust any device she owned to be fully reliable. Her cracked datapad sat on the upturned coolant crate she used as a bedside table, its screen fractured in the upper left corner in a pattern that looked vaguely like a river delta if she was tired enough and chose to find it beautiful. She had bought it from a man named Darrett who had described it as having only minor memory corruption. In the 14 months since, it had twice sent her messages she hadn't written, deleted an entire week of shift records, and once, memorably, displayed her contact list in an order that appeared to be alphabetical by some alphabet she could not identify. She kept it because she could not afford another one and because, despite everything, it worked. The morning processed itself around her in the way that poor mornings do, efficiently, without ceremony, organized entirely around function. She ate standing at the narrow counter in their unit's kitchen, which was less a kitchen and more a corridor with ambitions, spooning protein paste from a canister while reviewing the shift rotation on her unreliable datapad. Paul was still asleep behind the partition they had strung between their two sleeping spaces using cargo netting salvaged from a decommissioned supply drone. He slept the way only the very young and the completely certain sleep, deeply, with conviction, taking up more space than was strictly reasonable. She listened to his breathing for a moment before she left, the way she always did, because she had been doing it since he was 6 years old and she had decided, without anyone asking her to, that keeping him breathing was her primary professional occupation. The Eastern Filtration Hub was a 20-minute walk through Crest 9's main corridor network, a series of pressurized tunnels that connected the settlement's 8 residential blocks to its industrial and processing sections. The walls were the particular color of metal that has been cleaned many times but never quite restored, lit by overhead panels that flickered at slightly different frequencies, in a way that the settlement's medical officer had once publicly suggested might be contributing to the population's unusually high rate of headaches, and that the settlement's administrative board had officially noted and subsequently done nothing about. Lyra walked it the same way she walked every morning, with the measured pace of someone who knows exactly how long every step takes and has calculated their arrival time down to the minute. She did not check her datapad until her break, 4 hours into the shift, when she sat on a coolant housing in the access corridor outside Processing Bay 3 with a thermos of something the vending unit called coffee, and which bore a philosophical rather than literal relationship to that description. The notification was sitting in her messages between a recycler maintenance reminder and an unsolicited offer to refinance a credit line she didn't have. It was marked with the imperial seal, the 16-pointed star of the Solvar Empire, rendered in gold pixels that her cracked screen displayed as gold pixels with a small green anomaly in the upper left, which meant the star appeared to be growing something. She read the message. She read it again. She looked at the imperial seal for a long time. She looked at the green anomaly. She read the message a third time. Congratulations, Lyra Van of Crest 9. You have been selected as a candidate in the imperial selection ceremony. Please present yourself to the nearest imperial administrative office within 14 days to confirm your participation. Failure to respond will be interpreted as voluntary withdrawal. She sat with this information for what felt like a reasonable amount of time and was probably 40 seconds. Then she called Paul. He answered on the fifth ring, which meant he had been awake and was pretending not to be, which was a thing he did when he had done something he wasn't sure about yet. She asked him, with the careful precision of someone diffusing a device in an access corridor 4 hours into a filtration shift, whether he had, at any point in the recent past, submitted her biometric profile to the Imperial Selection Ceremony lottery. There was a pause. He said he had technically done that, but that he had not genuinely expected anything to come of it, and that she had to admit, objectively, it was at least somewhat funny. Her irises, which she had spent her entire life training herself to control, shifted from their resting silver to something she had no name for, a pale, washed gold, the color of a screen showing a message that cannot possibly be real on a datapad that has already proven it will do absolutely anything. The Imperial transport that collected Lyra from Crest 9 was the largest enclosed space she had ever been inside that was also moving, and she spent the first hour of the journey sitting in a seat that cost more than her unit's annual heating allowance, trying to look like someone for whom this was unremarkable. The seat adjusted itself to her posture 3 times without being asked. She found this unsettling in a way she could not entirely articulate, the specific discomfort of being anticipated by furniture. She sat very still after the third adjustment, spine straight, hands folded in her lap, and the seat did not move again, which she chose to interpret as a mutual understanding. The Imperial envoy assigned to escort her was a man named Foss, who had the immaculate bearing of someone trained to show nothing and the eyes of someone currently showing quite a lot. He had arrived on Crest 9 in a suit that cost more than the settlement's secondary recycler unit, stood in the main corridor with the careful stillness of a man who had been briefed about the air quality and was choosing to breathe as little as possible, and presented Lyra with a 14-page document outlining the protocols and expectations of her candidacy. He had also presented her with a preliminary wardrobe package, 3 cases of clothing selected by the Imperial Style Office based on her biometric profile, which she had opened in her unit while Paul stood behind her and made the face he made when he was trying not to say something. She had worn her second-best work clothes for the departure because the Imperial clothing felt, in her hands, like something she was not yet authorized to put on her body. Paul had told her she was being ridiculous. She had told him he was not wrong, but that she was doing it anyway. He had hugged her at the docking corridor for long enough that she had to be the one to let go first, and she had walked onto the transport with her one bag and her cracked datapad, and the 17-page fork orientation document she had already read twice, and she had not looked back because she had found in 23 years that not looking back was a skill with practical applications. The palace appeared in the transport's forward viewport approximately 6 hours later, and Lyra, who had decided to be composed about this, pressed her forehead against the viewport glass and stared at it for a full 30 seconds before she remembered Foss was sitting across the aisle. She straightened. Foss was writing something in his datapad. She was fairly certain she knew what he was writing. The structure was not so much large as it was a renegotiation of what large meant, an orbital platform that had been built over 3 centuries into something that had stopped being a building and become something closer to a geography. Its outer sections caught the light of the central star and redistributed it in ways that seemed architecturally deliberate, as though the palace had opinions about illumination and the resources to enforce them. Lyra thought privately that it looked like someone had designed it during a period of extreme confidence and then, rather than revising anything, had simply continued. The preparation period before the ceremony was 4 days, and they were the 4 strangest days of her life, which was a sentence that required some context to fully appreciate. She was assigned quarters that were larger than the entire residential section of Crest Nine's Block 4. She was assigned Thessaly, whose official title was Protocol Integration Specialist, and whose actual function appeared to be standing beside Lyra at all times, with the focused energy of someone who had been given a very specific problem and intended to solve it through the application of sheer professional will. Thessaly had managed 7 imperial selection candidates in her career. She told Lyra this on the first morning. Lyra asked how many of those candidates had come from outer settlements. Thessaly smiled in the way people smile when a question has confirmed something they already suspected, and said that Lyra was the first. Lyra said that explained the expression Foss had been wearing for 4 days. Thessaly laughed, briefly, genuinely, and then recomposed herself in under 2 seconds, which was impressive enough that Lyra made a mental note of it. The cosmetic preparation on the morning of the ceremony was a procedure she submitted to with the same attitude she brought to particularly invasive maintenance work: present, cooperative, and privately reserving judgment. A team of 5 specialists worked on her in a room that smelled of compounds she had no names for, applied treatments to her skin and hair with instruments that hummed at frequencies she felt in her back teeth, and undressed her bioluminescent fingers with the focused professionalism of people who had been specifically briefed and were handling the briefing's implications in real time. She was given gloves. The gloves were extraordinary. She thought about the cargo netting partition in her unit on Crest 9 and then decided not to think about it. The ceremony was everything the orientation document had promised, and several things it hadn't, including the moment when the Crown Prince, Salvar, took her hand at the formal presentation, and she noticed that his collar was sitting at an angle that no one around him seemed willing to address. She told him so, quietly, before the official binding. He looked startled. Then he laughed, not a polished laugh, a real one, and said that she was the first person in his memory who had said something true to him before a ceremony rather than after. She said she would try to maintain the standard. Her headache, which had begun quietly that morning and which she had attributed without much thought to the atmospheric adjustment, settled in behind her eyes and stayed there, patient and uninvited, as the ceremony proceeded around her in all its magnificent, expensive, carefully calibrated light. 3 months into her life at the palace, Lyra had mastered 11 of the 17 fork varieties, could execute a formal curtsy without Thessaly's corrective hand signal from across the room, and had developed a headache so persistent and so reliably present that she had begun to think of it as a roommate. Not a welcome one, more the kind that had arrived without a confirmed invitation and was now settled into the furniture with no visible intention of leaving. She did not mention it to anyone for 6 weeks, which was not denial so much as it was a survival instinct so deeply encoded in her that it operated below the level of conscious decision. On Crest 9, you did not report a symptom unless it was preventing you from working, because reporting a symptom that wasn't preventing you from working meant admitting a vulnerability that the settlement's particular social ecology would remember long after the symptom resolved. She knew, intellectually, that the palace was not Crest 9. She knew that the palace's medical resources were of a quality that Crest 9's single-room clinic, staffed by a rotating physician who visited twice a month and always looked slightly surprised to be there, could not have imagined. She knew all of this and still said nothing, because knowing a thing and acting on it are 2 different competencies, and she had only ever been trained in one of them. Noticed something was wrong before she told him, which she found both touching and mildly inconvenient. He had the particular attentiveness of someone who had grown up surrounded by people paid to manage his environment, and had consequently become very alert to the things that fell outside management, the unscripted moments, the unrehearsed expressions, the small silences that didn't fit the situation. He asked her one evening directly whether she was well. She told him she was adjusting. He said that adjusting and well were not the same thing. She told him he was more perceptive than she had initially credited him for. He said he was choosing to take that as a compliment. She said he was welcome to it. The palace physicians arrived with the energy of people who had been given an interesting problem, and the confidence of people who had never encountered a problem they couldn't resolve with equipment expensive enough. There were 3 of them at the initial examination, and they conducted it with a thoroughness that impressed her and a framework that, she would understand only later, was the entire source of the difficulty. They were excellent physicians. They were excellent at treating bodies that were like the bodies they had always treated, which were bodies born into palace air and palace food and palace cosmetic protocols. Bodies whose immune systems had been calibrated over generations to process compounds that the outer settlements had never had the budget or the reason to develop. They ran their tests. They reviewed their results. They used the phrase unusual presentation 4 times in 40 minutes, which she counted. They prescribed a cellular restoration supplement that tasted like the color beige and adjusted the dosage on her weekly treatment protocol upward, which was, though no one understood this yet, the specific wrong direction. She took the supplements because she had been told to. Her appetite, which had already become erratic in ways she had been quietly managing around her public schedule, grew more unpredictable. There were mornings when the thought of the traditional royal breakfast, a meal of extraordinary quality and elaborate preparation that the kitchen staff assembled with evident pride, produced in her a response that had nothing to do with appetite and everything to do with her body conducting its own private referendum on the situation. Thessaly, who noticed everything, said nothing directly, but began ensuring that there was always a simpler option available at meals without making it a subject of discussion, which was an act of such precise and wordless consideration that Lyra, who had not cried once since leaving Crest 9, came very close in the corridor outside the formal dining room on a Thursday afternoon, and then recomposed herself in under 3 seconds. She felt briefly that Thessaly would have approved of the time. Paul arrived on a Tuesday, which felt thematically appropriate given that the entire situation had begun on a Tuesday, and the sight of him stepping off the intersettlement transit in the palace's secondary receiving bay, wearing his best jacket, which she recognized because it used to be her jacket, and looking around at the palace's secondary receiving bay with the expression of someone whose brain was attempting to process more square footage than it had previously been asked to accommodate. This was the first moment in 3 months that something in her chest loosened into something that felt like actual relief rather than managed composure. He told her the palace was absurd. She agreed. He said the food at the reception desk was better than anything he had eaten in his entire life, and that he felt conflicted about this. She told him the conflict would pass and then the food would just be food. He said he was taller than her now, and that this was something he wanted formally acknowledged. She acknowledged it. He hugged her the way he had hugged her at the docking corridor on Crest 9, which was to say completely, and without any apparent concern for dignity. And she let it happen, and did not rush it, and thought about the cargo netting partition, and the protein paste, and the recycler noise, and the way mornings on Crest 9 processed themselves without ceremony, and found, to her measured surprise, that she did not want to be back there, only that she wanted to bring pieces of it forward with her, and that these were different wishes. He looked at her face for a long time over dinner and said, without preamble, that she didn't look right. Her irises shifted to silver before she could prevent it, the pale color of the thing she was carrying carefully, and Paul watched it happen with the eyes of someone who had known her for 15 years and understood exactly what silver meant and said nothing further, which settled into the air between them and stayed there, heavier than anything either of them had said aloud. She did not fall dramatically. That was the thing she would remember most clearly afterward, that her body, which had been carrying the weight of 3 months of slow, accumulated damage with the stoic efficiency she had applied to everything since she was 9 years old, did not choose a dramatic moment to stop cooperating. It chose a diplomatic reception on a Wednesday evening, in a room full of imperial delegates from 7 territories, while a string ensemble played something stately in the corner. She sat down in a ceremonial chair very carefully, with the precise and deliberate movement of someone who has done the math and determined that sitting is the only structurally sound option remaining, and she did not get up. Urin was across the room. She watched him register what had happened in the specific sequence that she had come to understand was particular to him. First, his expression didn't change, because he had been trained since birth to maintain composure in public, and then something behind his eyes changed completely, and then he was moving through the room with a focused calm that cleared a path without requiring anyone to be asked to move. He dismissed the physicians, dismissed Thessaly, dismissed the assembled delegates of 7 territories with the same efficient grace, lifted her without ceremony, and carried her out through the palace's eastern corridor, while a room full of people watched in the particular silence of those witnessing something that will be discussed for decades. She told him, from the position of being carried through a corridor in a palace, that this was going to be extremely difficult to explain to the diplomatic record. He said the diplomatic record could manage. She said his collar was crooked again. He laughed once, short and genuine, and did not put her down. The specialist they brought in afterward was named Seven Okur, and he arrived with the specific energy of someone who had spent a career being told their field was academically marginal, and had developed a very particular relationship with being underestimated. He was a xenobiologist whose work focused on comparative biological responses across imperial territories, which was a field that sounded, to most of the palace's medical establishment, like something one studied when one had not been admitted to the more serious programs. He reviewed Lyra's complete file in 4 hours, requested 3 additional tests that none of the previous physicians had ordered, and then sat across from her in the medical suite with the expression of someone whose framework had just accommodated everything that had previously refused to fit, and said that he understood what was happening, and that he was sorry it had taken this long to be the person in the room who did. The explanation arrived in layers, the way the damage itself had, not as a single revelation, but as a series of small ones that accumulated their weight as they came. The traditional royal foods, prepared to generations-old imperial specifications, contained trace compounds that the palace-born metabolized with adaptations so thoroughly integrated into their biology that the compounds didn't register as anything worth measuring. Lyra's body had never developed those adaptations, because Crest 9's food production had never contained those compounds, because Crest 9 did not have the resources to produce food that required that kind of metabolic infrastructure to process safely. The cosmetic treatments, the cellular luminosity protocols, the weekly ionic restoration sequences, were calibrated to immune systems that had been calibrated to them in return, across generations, a long biological conversation between privilege and biology that had arrived at a mutual language her body had never been taught. The palace atmosphere, the processed and perfected air of the climate-controlled sections, ran through chemical filtration systems designed to produce optimal air for optimal bodies, and the compounds that made it optimal for those bodies accumulated in her lungs in concentrations that her settlement-adapted respiratory system, built for industrial recycling and the grinding work of making breathable air from nothing, could not process quietly or without cost. She listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap, and her irises cycling through colors slowly enough that Okur, who had read her file thoroughly, tracked the shifts without commenting on them. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough that Urin, sitting beside her, reached over and placed his hand over hers. She looked at their hands. She looked at Okur. She asked, with the careful precision she had always brought to information that required integration before response, whether the irony was something they were going to acknowledge openly, or whether they were going to proceed as though the situation did not contain, at its center, the most comprehensively terrible joke she had ever encountered. Oker said he thought acknowledging it was probably healthier. She said that she had left a settlement where poverty was shortening everyone's lives and come to a palace where luxury had been shortening hers, and that the difference was primarily one of aesthetic and timeline. Urin made a sound that was technically not a laugh. She told him it was permitted. The choice was not a simple one, and Oker did not present it as one. She could reduce her time in the palace's fully climate-controlled sections, reintroduce dietary elements her biology recognized, discontinue the cosmetic protocols that were compounding the damage. The palace could change around her, not everything, not immediately, but with intention and with the resources that the